The Meek Shall Inherit by Richard Chizmar. Read by Scott MacDonald. Would you eat a dog turd for $100? Brian stopped mid-shot, the basketball poised above his head. He looked over at his friend standing in the driveway. Dry turd or fresh and wet? Jimmy considered the question and answered with a crooked smile. Moist. Couple hours old. Brian dribbled to the baseline and shot. Swish. He gathered the loose ball and drilled a pass into Jimmy's scrawny chest. Make it, or you're the horse again. Jimmy dribbled awkwardly to the baseline, started to shoot. Back up, you little cheater. Jimmy flipped his best friend the finger and backed up a few steps, took the shot. Airball. Brian threw his arms in the air and ran around the court, hooting, Brian Anderson, champion of the world. Jimmy shook his head and kicked the ball into the front yard. Dick-sucking champion of the world. Out on the street, a muscular, bare-chested teenager cruised by on a skateboard. He glanced at the two boys standing in the driveway and smirked. You girls having fun playing kickball? Jimmy took a step toward the road. Your mom had fun playing with my... Brian came up behind him, clamped a hand over his friend's mouth, silencing him in mid-insult. But it was too late. The musclehead on the skateboard grinded to a stop. What was that? He was talking to me, Brian said. Not you, Billy. Brian squeezed Jimmy's shoulder, and Jimmy got the hint. Ow, yeah, I wasn't talking to you. Billy glared at them for a moment, deciding whether they were worth the trouble. He looked up and down the street. Most bullies, Brian believed, had a kind of grown-up radar, and then he gave them the double bird and pushed off down the street. Brian sat down in the grassy front yard and let out a deep breath. Jesus, Jimmy, you and your big mouth. Jimmy plopped down next to him. I think we could take him. I think you're wrong. He's not that tough. He's 15. We're 12. He smokes and has arms the size of our legs. We still have sleepovers. Jimmy shrugged. Nothing wrong with sleepovers. They're fun. Brian couldn't argue with that, so he laid back and stared at the passing clouds overhead. Jimmy plucked blades of grass and flicked them into the air, one after the other. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. Jimmy finally broke the silence. This sucks. Second week of summer vacation, and we're already bored. At least you were at the lake all last week, Brian said, squinting at a cloud that resembled an alligator. Yeah, with my mom and dad, like that's any fun. Do you have any idea how much sunscreen my mom makes me wear? Brian laughed. He did have an idea. He had seen it many times firsthand at the neighborhood swimming pool. When Jimmy's mom was finished with him, Jimmy looked like a skinny little yeti ready to prowl a snowy mountaintop. And my dad, did you know he still wears a Speedo? Brian belly laughed. He couldn't help it. Not funny, dude. It's freaking embarrassing. You can practically see his junk. Thinking about Mr. Gallagher's junk was not a pretty picture. Jimmy's old man weighed about 300 pounds, and that was naked. How he had produced a beanpole of a son, that's what he always called Jimmy, was a mystery to everyone. Brian shook away the disturbing image, sat up and patted Jimmy on the back. Come on, let's play another game of horse. Jimmy groaned and pushed himself to his feet just as a van slowed out on the road and swung into the driveway next door. The boys watched a middle-aged man, tall and thin, bald and wearing thick glasses, get out of the van and walk toward the house. Hi, Mr. Pruitt, Jimmy yelled, waving. The man flinched, like he had been woken from a daydream, and looked over at the boys. He opened his mouth like he was going to say something, then closed it again and gave them a shy wave before disappearing into the front door. That was weird, Brian said. Jimmy nodded, still staring at the closed front door. He's been like that for a while now. My mom says it's because he's still in mourning. Didn't Mrs. Pruitt die like a year ago? Jimmy shrugged. My mom says it takes a long time, especially when you've been together for so many years. And just like that, Jimmy was thinking about Mrs. Pruitt's kind face and her sweet voice and her chocolate chip cookies, and he felt his eyes filling up. You okay, man? Brian asked. Jimmy turned away, wiping his eyes. I'm fine. It's just sad, that's all. I feel sorry for him. Me too. I don't ever want to get married, Jimmy said. No worries there, retard. What chick is going to be dumb enough to marry your ugly ass? Jimmy was bright enough in the ways of childhood to understand the 12-year-old translation of this insult was, It's all going to be okay, buddy. So he returned the favor. Plenty. Starting with your sister. Brian tackled him, and the two boys rolled around in the front yard, laughing and wrestling, until Jimmy's mom poked her head out the front door a few minutes later and called Jimmy inside for dinner. Later that evening, a June thunderstorm swept in from the north, turning curbside gutters into miniature rapids and knocking out electricity for most of the town, including both sides of Jimmy's street. By 10 o'clock the next morning, the storm had cleared out. The sky was a brilliant robin egg blue, and the electric was back up and running at Jimmy's house. Jimmy and Brian sat across from each other on the front porch. Half-finished glasses of lemonade and stacks of baseball cards covered the small table, which sat between them. After an hour of intense bargaining, arguing, about fair trades, both boys were slumped back in plastic patio chairs, staring at the screens of their cell phones. Damn it, Jimmy moaned and tossed his phone onto the table, knocking over a pile of cards. I'm getting tired of Hearthstone. Brian looked up from his phone. That's because you suck at Hearthstone. Jimmy ignored the dig and sat up in his chair, an uncharacteristically serious look on his face. Can I tell you something? Brian recognized the tone of his friend's voice and knew it was something important. The last time he'd heard that tone of voice was when Jimmy confided in him about seeing Jan Thompson changing into a bathing suit through her bedroom window. He was 11 then. Brian turned off his game. Sure. What's up? You promised not to laugh. Brian shrugged. I promised to try not to. What's going on, man? Jimmy looked over his left shoulder at the house and then over his right at the front yard. Seemingly content that no one was eavesdropping, he scooted his chair closer to Brian, lowered his voice. You remember what we were talking about yesterday? About Mr. Pruitt? About him being sad? Jimmy shook his head. About him being different, acting weird. Okay, yeah. Jimmy looked over his shoulder again in the direction of his next-door neighbor's house, then back at Brian. I was thinking about it last night, remembering things. He took a deep breath. I think something bad might be going on over there. What exactly does something bad mean? Brian slid his chair a little closer. Jimmy thought about it for a moment before answering. You promised you wouldn't laugh. Just tell me what you... I think Mr. Pruitt might be a serial killer. Brian laughed in his friend's face, then immediately regretted it as he watched Jimmy's cheeks flush, beet red in anger and embarrassment. You promised, Jimmy hissed, jumping to his feet and heading off the porch. Brian chased after him. I promised to try not to laugh, and I couldn't help it. I'm sorry, man, but Mr. Pruitt, a serial killer? That's just nutty. Jimmy spun on him, his eyes darting all around the yard. Keep your voice down, Brian whispered. Okay, I'm sorry. Come on. Jimmy led Brian across the still wet front lawn, away from the house, to the curb, where they sat side by side, their bare feet resting in the slow trickling runoff that still flowed down the street toward a distant sewer grate. Jimmy sat there silently, pouting, staring down at the ground. He flicked a pebble on the road with his big toe, cleared his throat, coughed. Finally, he looked up at Brian and said, "I've seen things, heard things." "Things?" Brian said. "Like the time you thought you saw a UFO landing in the woods behind the park? Or the time you thought you saw the librarian from school holding up a bank on the evening news? The lady in the security video looked just like her, and—" Brian put out his hands in surrender. "All I'm saying is that you watch a lot of movies and have a big imagination and tell a lot of crazy stories." He glanced at the house next door. "Mr. Pruitt is a cool guy. Remember when he helped us fix our go-kart? And when he bought all our lemonade when no one else was even slowing down to take a look? I know he's a nice guy, Brian. How about when he covered for us to your parents the night we were bombing cars with snowballs? He saved our asses. Look, I know Mr. Pruitt has always been nice to us, but my mom is right. He's changed since his wife died. So what? He's quiet now, keeps to himself. Maybe he's a little weird. Doesn't make him a serial killer." "I've heard screams over there." Brian looked closely at his friend. "Screams?" Jimmy nodded. "Couple of times. Last week when you were at the lake." "And you're sure?" Jimmy nodded again. "First time I was raking grass in the backyard, and I wasn't 100% sure what I'd heard. But the next evening I was back there shooting my BB gun, and I heard it again. I'm sure." "Okay, what else?" "The van. What about it?" "What does an old guy like that need with a van? I mean, why trade in a perfectly good Cadillac for a van when you're all alone?" Brian shrugged. Maybe the Cadillac reminded him too much of his wife. And he's been shopping a lot. Every day he brings home something new. So what? What's he need with a video camera and a tripod? I watched him haul in 2 metal cages the other day. What's he need cages for? Maybe he bought a dog. Must be the kind of dog that never needs to go outside then." Brian rolled his eyes. "What else, Sherlock?" "The night before you came home, I was helping my dad lay down mulch in the front yard when Mr. Pruitt came home. He'd backed the van into the driveway and was unloading something into his carport, so my dad sent me over there to help. But he didn't want my help. He acted all nervous and pretty much shooed my ass out of there. But I saw some of what he was unloading." "What was it?" "I didn't really know at first. It was all these big sheets of insulation and big foam panels and boxes of sealant and glue." Jimmy, dead serious, locked his eyes on his friend's face. "I looked it up on the internet later that night. I had memorized the exact brands I saw on the boxes. It was all material for soundproofing a room." Brian looked down at the wet pavement, his mind turning. He knew Jimmy liked to tell stories. He always had, but he also knew Jimmy was the smartest kid in the entire middle school. "What do you think?" Jimmy prodded. Brian looked up at his friend. "I think I should spend the night at your house tonight, and we should keep a close eye on Mr. Pruitt's house." "Be quiet, or he's going to hear us," Jimmy whispered. "He's not even home, dork. How's he going to hear us?" "Oh, yeah." Despite the serious nature of their investigation, both boys giggled as they crawled on their bellies along the side of Mr. Pruitt's house. It was dusk now. Fireflies blinked in the coming darkness. Crickets chirped their night symphony in the tall grass. A hush lay over the neighborhood. As the morning had passed into afternoon, and afternoon into evening, the boys' moods had lightened. They spent the majority of the day playing wiffle ball in the park with their friends and watching high school girls in short shorts and tank tops playing frisbee. They'd been disappointed to discover that Mr. Pruitt hadn't returned home when they'd first come outside after dinner. To pass the time, they'd gone back in the house and watched the first 3 innings of the Orioles game with Jimmy's father in the den. Once it was dark enough, they'd told Jimmy's dad that they were going to the store for ice cream and were once again disappointed to not find Mr. Pruitt's van parked in his driveway or carport. Instead of waiting any longer, they'd decided to take advantage of his absence and investigate his ground-level basement windows. Brian led the way, slithering flat on his stomach like a snake, just a dozen or so feet away from the first window, with Jimmy right behind him. For both boys, it felt a lot like playing Army when they were younger. "Ugh, I think I just put my elbow in dog crap," Jimmy whined. Brian giggled softly. "Maybe Mr. Pruitt got that dog after all. Oh, shut up." They both shut up and kept crawling. After another minute, Brian looked back over his shoulder and asked, "What are we going to say if your dad looks out the window and sees us?" "That's easy. We say we're looking for toads in the window wells. Remember how we used to collect them in buckets? Sometimes I actually forget that you're so smart. Almost there." Brian crawled another few feet and stopped and let out a quiet gasp. Jimmy crawled around him and halted at his side, leaning up on his elbows for a better look. The narrow basement window had been blacked out. It was hard to tell in the shadows, but it looked like someone had taken thick black tape and covered the inside of the glass with it. Whatever it was, you definitely couldn't see through it. "Believe me now," Jimmy whispered. "Wake up." Brian went on snoring. Jimmy poked his friend in the ribs again, harder this time. "Come on, wake up." Brian groaned and rolled onto his side. "Let me alone." "He's home," Jimmy whispered, and crawled to the window. Brian sat up in his sleeping bag on the floor. "What time is it?" "Almost midnight. He just pulled in. Hurry up." Brian kicked his way out of the sleeping bag and, rubbing his eyes, joined his friend at the window. "What's he doing?" "Nothing yet. He's still in the van." They watched in silence, their faces pressed close to the window. Mr. Pruitt's lawn and driveway were lost in a spider web of shadows. "You sure he's still in there?" Brian asked. Before Jimmy could answer, the driver's side door opened. The van's interior light flashed on, and the boys had a clear view of Mr. Pruitt stepping out onto the driveway. He closed the door with a muffled thud, and the night swallowed him. Brian shifted for a better look and bumped his head against the window. "Be careful," Jimmy whispered. "He could hear us. I can't see him. Did he go inside?" "I never saw the front door open. Maybe he went in the side door, under the carport. Or maybe he's sneaking over here right now for a closer look at us," Brian teased. "And he's wearing a clown mask and carrying a butcher knife." Jimmy punched his friend in the shoulder. "That's not funny." "Hey, there he is," Brian whispered, pointing out the window. A narrow slice of dim light appeared at the back of the van. The boys squinted into the shadows and could just make out the bottom half of Mr. Pruitt's legs. The upper half of his body was blocked by the open rear door. "What's he doing?" Jimmy asked. "Getting something out of the back of the van, I think." "I told you, didn't I? I told you." The door closed with another thud, and even though the driveway was thrown back into shadow, the boys' eyes had adjusted to the dark well enough for them to catch a glimpse of Mr. Pruitt disappearing into the carport, carrying a large burlap sack over his shoulder. The sack was moving in jerks and fits, as if whatever was trapped inside was struggling to get out. "Are you crazy? We can't call the police, not yet." It was the next morning, and a sleep-deprived Jimmy was pacing on his front porch. His mother had made the boys a breakfast of scrambled eggs and bacon and toast and taken off for a day of shopping with one of her girlfriends. The boys had the house to themselves for the rest of the morning and afternoon. "What do you mean, not yet?" Brian asked, watching his friend stroll back and forth like one of those sick tigers you always saw at the zoo. He could have had a little kid in that sack. "You have any idea what my father will do to me if we call the police on Mr. Pruitt and we're wrong? I'll be grounded for the rest of the summer. Now we're wrong? You're the one who was so sure. You even have me half convinced." Jimmy stopped pacing, walked over to his friend. "Listen, we're not wrong. Something weird is going on over there. We just have to figure out what it is before we tell my parents or call the police. And how are we going to do that?" Jimmy tilted his head in a way that Brian immediately recognized as trouble. "Oh, shit, I know that look." Jimmy smiled. His face was pale and drawn, but his eyes were bright. "Mr. Pruitt never comes home for lunch. Ever. We're in and out in 10 minutes. Brian groaned. "I knew it. We empty our pockets beforehand. Nothing we might leave behind on accident. Yes, I learned that from a movie. I'll set the timer on my watch. 10 minutes and we're gone, no matter what. How are we getting in? The doors will be locked." Jimmy pulled 2 objects out of the back pocket of his jeans, a small screwdriver and a laminated GameStop membership card. "Your Uncle Manny?" Brian asked, eyebrows raised. Manny was Jimmy's dad's black sheep younger brother. He talked too loud, drank too much, and had actually done time when he was barely in his 20s. He was firecrackers and magic tricks and dirty jokes, a big kid with a heart of gold. Jimmy smiled that tired smile of his and nodded. "Good old Uncle Manny. He promised to show me how to hotwire a car one day, too. He said it's a lot harder than in the movies." Brian stood behind his friend at Mr. Pruitt's back door, glancing anxiously over his shoulder. "Just hurry the hell up, will you?" "The key is to not leave any marks on the door frame in case you have to come back later." Jimmy carefully wedged the screwdriver in a little further and jiggled it up and down. "We ain't coming back later. I know that, just saying." He held the screwdriver in place with his left hand and removed the card from his pocket with his other hand. He aligned the card between the wooden door frame and the metal latch, then started swiping it up and down. After a moment, he stopped and wiped his hand on his jeans. "Sweaty. Guess I'm nervous." "That makes 2 of us," Brian said. "Hey, if we're being so careful, why aren't we wearing gloves or something?" "Don't need 'em. It gets to the point where cops are over here lifting fingerprints. We're screwed anyway." The thought made Brian even more nervous. "We should just give it up, man. It's not going to work." There was an audible click, and the door swung inward a few inches. They caught a glimpse of linoleum floor inside. Jimmy looked back at his friend. "You were saying—" "Oh, shut up." Jimmy stuffed the screwdriver and membership card back into his pocket, carefully nudged the door open, and stepped inside. Brian followed right behind him and started to close the door. "Leave it open, in case we have to make a quick escape. Let me guess, you saw it in a movie." "As a matter of fact, I did." "Jesus," Brian said, looking around. "What's the smell?" They were standing in Mr. Pruitt's kitchen, and it was a mess. Dirty dishes were stacked in the sink and on the surrounding countertop. Empty pizza and Chinese food delivery boxes littered the kitchen table and overflowed from the trash can. There was a pile of old newspapers stacked in front of the dishwasher. "I have a bad feeling about this," Jimmy whispered. Brian, eyes wide, nodded in agreement. "The smell is coming from "Down there," Jimmy said, motioning to a door in the adjoining hallway. "Basement?" Jimmy nodded and headed that way. "I was afraid you were going to say that," Brian said, following. "I used to come down here every Christmas Eve when I was little to see Mr. Pruitt's train set." Jimmy opened the door into complete darkness. He gathered his courage and slid his hand along the wall just inside the doorway until he found the light switch and flipped it on. The stairway was long and narrow, and covered in the same ugly shade of gold carpeting Jimmy remembered from years past. "After you," Brian said, his voice cracking. They slowly started down the stairs, and both boys heard and smelled the animals before they actually saw them. "What the hell is that?" Jimmy asked. And then they reached the bottom of the stairway and turned the corner. The room erupted into a cacophony of frantic barking and growling and whining as soon as the boys walked into view. The entire length of one wall was lined with small cages. There had to be 20 or more of them, each secured with a heavy padlock. Inside the metal cages were mostly dogs and cats, but there were also squirrels and rabbits and even a raccoon. And positioned along the adjoining wall, underneath one of the blacked-out basement windows, were 2 large, clear plastic hutches, each containing a monkey. The wiry monkeys skittered from one side of their enclosures to the other, eyes bugging, clawing madly to get out. Jimmy stood a few feet from the bottom of the stairway, his mind racing to register what his eyes were seeing. The smell was horrible here in the closed room, a toxic mixture of piss and crap and something chemical he could almost taste on his tongue. The basement walls were soundproofed. "Some serial killer," Brian said from behind him in a booming voice. He walked deeper into the room, laughing with relief. "Old man Pruitt is Dr. Doolittle. Sometimes they start by torturing animals," Jimmy said, his words almost drowned out by the animal screeches. "Then they move on to people." Brian pointed out a stainless steel table with leather straps in the far corner of the basement. Syringes and vials of what looked like medicine were lined up on a nearby shelf. "Looks like he's trying to help them, not torture them." Jimmy glanced in the opposite corner of the room, noticed a computer, its monitor screen glowing, sitting on a small desk next to a printer. He headed that way. Behind him, Brian bent down and reached his hand through one of the cages. A mangy cocker spaniel gently licked his fingers. "Poor little guy, all cramped up in there." He got to his feet and studied several of the other cages. "Helping or not, they shouldn't be locked up like this. Most of them don't even have water." Jimmy stopped in front of the desk, reached out and nudged the mouse, and the screensaver image of a sunny beach disappeared and was replaced by a series of strange letters and numbers. He leaned closer, trying to remember where he had seen something similar. "Hey, Jimmy," Brian said from behind him. "Wonder what the suit's for." He looked over and saw Brian struggling to hold up a full-body suit, the heavy-duty kind you see astronauts wearing on television. A helmet with a clear faceplate hung from a hook on the wall next to him. "Beats me. Just put it back, man." Jimmy returned his attention to the computer screen, once again searching his memory for where he'd seen such writing. "I bet these keys are for the cages," Brian said. But Jimmy, lost in deep thought, didn't hear him. His eyes and nose stung from the horrible stench. His brain hurt from thinking. He was about to give up when the answer suddenly came to him, like a ship sailing free of a fog bank. He snapped his fingers. "It's Arabic. I remember it. From school." He scrolled down, then clicked on a blurry photo at the bottom of the computer screen, and almost screamed when something brushed against his pants leg. He looked down and saw a flash of black cat. He turned back to his friend and frowned. "What are you doing?" Loose dogs and cats scampered across the basement and up the stairs to freedom. As Jimmy watched, Brian flung open another cage door and lifted a fat rabbit onto the floor below. The rabbit hopped in a drunk circle, then raced away, joining the others. "What's it look like him doing?" He laughed and moved on to the next cage. Jimmy opened his mouth to protest, but before he could, screaming erupted from the computer behind him. Startled, he spun around and realized that a video was playing on the monitor. A dark-skinned man, wearing a filthy robe, sat strapped to a chair in the middle of a small room. He screamed and wailed and fought against his restraints to no avail. Harsh voices could be heard off-screen, speaking in a foreign language. After another 30 seconds of screaming, a scraggly mutt limped on screen. The man stopped screaming and started crying. The dog wagged its tail and licked the man's restrained hands. The man started screaming again and tried to jerk away, but before long the screams were drowned out by a deep guttural choking sound. The camera zoomed in on the man's face, and Jimmy could see blood and bile spilling from the man's mouth in a foamy mess. And then his eyes erupted in twin geysers of blood that dribbled down his cheeks, and after a few more seconds, the man went limp and quiet. The foreign voice spoke up again, and then someone shuffled on screen wearing a heavy-duty suit eerily similar to the one hanging on the wall right there in the basement. The puzzle pieces suddenly snapped into place inside Jimmy's brain, and his entire body went rigid with terror. "Brian!" All of a sudden he wished he had brought his cell phone. He wished it more than anything else in the world. "Brian, stop!" Brian was kneeling in front of the second monkey enclosure. The first hutch was empty, the door wide open. "Why? I feel sorry for him, Jimmy." Jimmy's voice was thick with surging fear. "He might not be a serial killer, but I think Mr. Pruitt is working with some very bad people." Brian pulled the open lock from the latch and tossed it to the floor beside him. "What kind of bad people? Like ISIS terrorist bad people?" Brian rolled his eyes. "Dude, you've seen too many movies. Mr. Pruitt's an old man. He's up to some weird shit down here, but he's as American as you and me." "I don't think so," Jimmy said, his legs feeling like rubber. "Not anymore." Brian yanked open the glass door, and the brown monkeys skittered into his arms. "Brian, don't." Brian, still down on a knee in front of the hutch, grinned and cradled the monkey in his arms like a baby. "Look how cute he is." He pressed his face close to the monkey's tiny head. "You're so cute. Yes, you are. You're so darn—" The words suddenly stopped. Brian's voice faded to a wet gargle. The monkey slipped from his arms and scampered happily away. Brian didn't move, just kept staring down at his lap, his long hair obscuring his face. Jimmy backed up a step. "You okay, man?" He didn't answer. Jimmy backed up another step. "Brian?" Brian slowly lifted his head, looked up at his friend. His eyes were bleeding. Dark foam bubbled from his open mouth. He rose up and reached out for Jimmy, took a zombie-like step forward, and then he collapsed to the ground, face first, convulsing. Jimmy stood there, frozen, watching his friend die. Everything made sense now. The animals, the vials, the chemical smell, the hazmat suit. And nothing made sense at all. He thought about his mother and father and his Uncle Manny, and he turned and sprinted for the stairs. He was almost to the top of the staircase when he felt something small and heavy latch onto his back with an ear-piercing screech. Sharp claws dug into his back, and he felt the brush of bristly fur against his neck. He staggered into the kitchen, flailing, trying to wrestle the beast off of him. Even in his panic, he noticed the dogs and cats fleeing outside through the open kitchen door, scattering in the yard, and running off in all directions, free again. His frantic mind chose that moment to flash another scene from a movie, and even amidst the chaos, it bothered him that he couldn't remember the title. Common house pets carrying a dangerous new strain of rabies, infected people going violently insane before dying agonizing deaths. Then, finally, the end of the world. Jimmy slammed his back against the kitchen wall, trying to shake the beast loose. He knocked piles of dishes to the floor where they shattered into pieces. He kicked over the pile of newspapers. The beast only screeched its awful banshee cry and dug its claws deeper into Jimmy's scalp. He stumbled out the door and into the backyard and felt the sun hit his tear-stained face. Its comforting warmth and blinding brightness filled his final moment of consciousness before the monkey lunged and buried its razor-sharp teeth deep in the flesh of Jimmy's neck. And then his throat was closing up like a caved-in mine shaft, and he couldn't breathe, and his skin felt like it had been set ablaze, and hot blood poured from his eyes in twin rivulets. And then he felt and saw nothing at all. This has been The Meek Shall Inherit, written by Richard Chizmar, read by Scott MacDonald. Thank you for listening.